not going? Well, let's talk to my political panel. Thrilled to say I'm joined by the editor of Labour Uncut, Atul Hatwal, and Lettice Bromovsky, who is my political commentator this evening, a political commentator as well as my one, here on Talk Radio. Evening to you both.
Evening, Cristo.
Evening.
Thanks for taking the time to talk to us this evening here on Talk Radio. So let's talk firstly about the COVID decision. No restrictions until the new year. What are we saying? Is this the right decision? Bearing in mind the rest of the UK brought in restrictions this morning. Some came in last night. What are we saying? Atul, is this the right decision by the Health Secretary and the Prime Minister?
I think for once, I'm going to agree that this is actually probably the right decision. Before Christmas, in the reports, there was a metric which said that if hospital admissions in London, which is where Omicron has been rampaging around, if hospital admissions were below 400, then actually no restrictions would be required. And hospital admissions are indeed below 400. There was an expectation set, a line's drawn, and if we're below the line, then let's proceed cautiously, but without restrictions.
And so you agree that this is good? I can't believe it.
Yeah, the point about being led by the evidence and managing the public's expectations is to be clear about where the lines are. So it's not that we must always lock down or must always be open, but if a new outbreak is occurring, like with Omicron, we need to have some guidance. So for the number 400 admissions in London, if we're below that, then actually it's not spreading as catastrophically as we might fear. That's what we need. We just need clear guidance. And this isn't a party political point, it's a competence point. Whether you're right or left, having that sense of, right, this is the number we're looking at, rather than kind of making it up on the fly. That's what we need.
I mean, I'm looking at the figures at the moment for London hospitalisations. You're quite right. I mean, they're sitting at around, if I can make it out, about 2,200 at the moment. And that is going up, but it's nowhere near the peak of London hospitalisations, which were knocking on 8,000 back in January. By this point in at the end of December, they were near to 6,000 exactly a year ago. I mean, Lettice, is it fair to say that the narrative over the last couple of weeks, and there have been very few media outlets calling out the narrative of the last couple of weeks, other than us, I would say, was there an overreaction? Did the narrative from the experts, the government, some political commentators not actually tally up with what many of us were saying, which was, look, Omicron seems milder. You do need to get hospitalised by some people will find themselves in hospital, but it is not going to be as bad as Delta.
Yeah, completely. No, I definitely believe that there has been an overreaction. I mean, even Angelique Coetzee, who was the discoverer of Omicron in South Africa, came out and she said that the UK might be overreacting to this variant. We've had these weeks of data from South Africa which have shown that it is less, provides less hospitalizations. We've also had the data from the Health National Security Agency, I can't remember its name, sorry, which has come out and said that it's 70% less likely for you to end up in hospital. This is the data that we've got to be looking at when we're making these decisions to lock down. And I am so glad that the decision has been made for now to postpone it to the new year.
Well, absolutely. And again, we've been saying this till we are blue in the face. It started off a University of Edinburgh report saying, actually, we think it's about 15% less likely to be hospitalised. Then it became an Imperial College report saying, actually, it could be up to 50% less likely. Then it ended up being a UK Health Security Agency report saying up to 70% less likely. I mean, has there at all been perhaps an arrogance here in the UK at dismissing what was happening there in South Africa? Because it was their figures and their experience, perhaps we were saying, well, actually, no, we need to do our own data first, when there was actually perfectly valid and credible data from there that we were choosing to ignore.
I fundamentally disagree. South Africa, the population of South Africa, the experience of South Africa is as uncomparable to the UK as you can get. It's a younger population. It's had a different profile of waves of COVID. So whilst they had Delta, they didn't have Alpha to the same extent. They didn't even have Beta to the same extent. The level of testing is very, very different. The level of reporting is very, very different. It's summer, not the depth of winter. So the idea that we should just take some figures from South Africa, I think is completely spurious. It's one of the reasons when Chris Whitty was doing his briefings to the government and indeed to parliamentarians, he was basically scathing about the idea that you can just take it from South Africa. There are two levels to understanding the caution which was justified. One is on severity and lethality, and it does seem to be less severe. The second is about the intersect between the spread of the disease and our operational capability to manage input and manage the operation of the NHS, but also more broadly, lots of our critical infrastructure. Even if it's less severe, if you have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who have COVID and then can't do their job, it doesn't matter that it's less severe if you have no one working A&E.
But so it's just
truck drivers.
So it's just coincidental that it turns out that what the narrative from South Africa is actually what it appears to be happening. It's just coincidental that the Imperial College, University of Edinburgh, and the UK Health Security Agency is now saying kind of the same thing.
It's not coincidental, but it is not the case that one can just take what was happening in South Africa, and that's why the research had to be done in this country. And that's
but we could have said, no, sorry, Atul, what we could have said was, right, we have this data. The Prime Minister, Chris Whitty and the others could have said, we have this data from South Africa. At the moment, that data is saying that Omicron seems milder. Now, don't panic, everyone. What we're going to do is keep reviewing things, keep going about your business, keep doing your Christmas shopping, keep going out and socialising, but be on standby that might change. Instead, what they did was they killed hospitality whilst panicking everyone.
In fairness to the government's advisors, as I said, there are two levels of threat. There is a clinical threat, which is if it was as severe as Delta, then that would have been terrible. But then there is if you like, a resilience, a management, an operational threat, which is if it spreads and that many people are off, how does our critical infrastructure operate?
All right. Look,
that's the nature of governments have to balance those threats.
I'll come back to you to make any more, and I'll let you respond to all of that. We must get to the news headlines, and when we come back, we'll continue this conversation. Still joined by my political panel, Atul Hatwell, who is the editor of Labour Uncut, and Lettice Bromovsky, political commentator. Evening once again to you both. Lettice, I just want to give you the chance to respond to what Atul was saying just before the news headlines. Essentially that it was wouldn't have been appropriate for the government to have mitigated the risk of Omicron by making direct comparisons to South Africa. We needed our own data. My suggestion that the government could have come on television, Boris could have come on television and said, look, this is here, don't panic anyone, let's wait and see, but be on standby, something might happen, but keep calm and carry on. That wouldn't have been an appropriate response. What do you say to that, Lettice?
Yeah, no, I'm completely in agreement with you here, Cristo. I think that this fear-mongering that we're getting from the media the whole time, or even from the government, is slightly out of control, and the impact it's having on society through our mental health, through the economic toll, the NHS backlog, these things are becoming significantly worse than the Omicron variant right now, which is seeing, this 70% less people going to hospitals and all of this. The other things that are building up are becoming significantly worse than potentially catching this variant of COVID for a short amount of time and maybe getting a little bit sick or even not being ill at all. We have to contain and manage expectations around this.
I mean, at the moment, I'm waiting for the daily Omicron overview, and I know that Sir Phil is keeping an eye on that as well. I fear we might not even get one today because it's a bank holiday. So to me, that does not strike me as something that we should be absolutely desperately scared about. South Africa have once again said, actually, you know what, our hospitalizations are plummeting and things are looking good. I just really worry that we've massively overreacted, and I worry more that Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, Scotland and Northern Ireland have brought back in the rule of 6. Atul, you must be thinking that is very heavy-handed based on everything that we know thus far?
I think in terms of, I think they made, there's a finely balanced choice. They could have waited to see the data. But let's think back to 1 year ago when some prominent voices at talkRADIO Towers were mocking the idea that we would have deaths at 200 a day. And there was a range of kind of evidence or argument that things weren't actually going to be so bad. And at the start of the year, we wrapped up well over 1,000 a day, day after day, where the stakes are so high, where it's tens of thousands of lives, hundreds of thousands of lives. To err on the side of caution for 1 week of restraint, I think is entirely understandable. And the polling of where the public is sits with that. The public understand the need for restraint because everyone knows someone who's lost someone, everyone everyone knows people who've been really heavily affected by it, whether it's through fatality, whether it's going to hospital, or whether it's through suffering from long COVID, the effects of which we don't fully understand. So when we use, one of the things that concerns me is when we use death as the only metric for harm from COVID, I do wonder about the thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who will have some form of long COVID and have their lives irreparably
perhaps
changed.
those talk radio presenters that you say were mocking, and I don't know of any that were mocking the death, but perhaps they were more worried about the deaths from other things that also occur. Nearly 500 cancer deaths a day that are pretty much being ignored. The 12 million, which is predicted to be the waiting list of the NHS by it being so COVID focused. People who can't get to see their GP, so therefore really important illnesses being ignored because of everyone putting their hands on decks for now a third vaccination, which could end up being a fourth vaccination.
Almost
Now,
inevitably.
you don't
Almost
need to.
inevitably will be a fourth.
You're
Almost
welcome.
inevitably will be a fourth.
But it is right and proper that we call into question those things happening. Myself, I actually understood the first lockdown. I completely got it. I completely understood the logic of it. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong to call into question whether those decisions are correct.
But I think, Cristo, your question to me was, why are the governments in Wales and Scotland acting in that way? And my answer is because last winter was so lethal, was and many of the same voices making the same arguments this time, and I think this time are being proved to be perhaps on the right side. But many of the same voices making the same arguments last time were so wrong. So many people died. There was such disruption and such extreme measures required with the depth of lockdown that went on so long. It's understandable why people are erring, or why governments are erring on the side of caution.
Okay.
However, you're talking about, all I was going to say is that you're talking about data and statistics from a year ago. If you look at data and statistics from right now, you can see that the hospital rates have remained basically steady since around September of this year. We're not seeing any dramatic increases or peaks or troughs around this variant. Yes, last year was an entirely different story. It was even a different variant. We've got to be looking at it right now. And I think that what Scotland and Wales are doing, it's sort of proved that all their rules of six, they brought in mandatory vaccine passports, and all these small rules that they've done have proved that they don't work, because they're the ones who have had higher cases at the moment than in England, and they're the ones who have gone back into a lockdown.
No one has a higher case rate than England at the moment, because it's absolutely ripping through London. I live in London. At no point in the pandemic have I known so many people who have had COVID. We're in double digits in London.
Yes, but how ill are they actually getting from it? Because there's a difference between getting a little bit of a cold and being hospitalized from something like this. And that's a differentiation.
But that's part of the basis for caution before Christmas, which is there's a lag between getting it and hospitalization rates moving and death rates moving. So that's another argument in favor of caution. When you see case rates rising so astronomically, it merits caution, given what happened last year, to make sure that hospitalisation doesn't follow.
Well, I concede the hospitalisations are going up, as they did in South Africa. I think they would go up with Omicron, but the last hospitalisation specific Omicron daily overview we had, which was Christmas Eve, there were across England 102,729 confirmed Omicron cases, and out of that 366 hospitalisations, under about 0.35% of people who had Omicron ended up in hospital, and the deaths, as tragic as they were, out of 102,729 confirmed Omicron cases, the deaths stood at 29.
Well, I mean, if you look at London's rates, the rates that the government were concerned about would have been a doubling every day of hospitalisation. The hospitalisations are rising. It's about 10% a day. In London, it's overwhelmingly driven by Omicron. But 10% a day, given how quickly this wave should move through, means that actually, fingers crossed, we're not in a position where the NHS will be overwhelmed. But I'll go back to my point, given what happened last year, you want your own data. We want UK data. We want to validate that it's not going to blow through the NHS, that we aren't going to have hundreds of thousands of people off who aren't necessarily dying or hospitalised, but can't go to work, so that the A&Es aren't staffed, so that operations can't happen, and the NHS grinds to a halt.
All right.
That caution is merited.
Let's talk about a couple of other stories, because there are a few other stories in town. Let's talk about the future looking pretty bleak for Boris Johnson. Really massive poll, 25,000 people. They drilled down into different constituencies, and they predicted that Boris Johnson, if he went for an election today, he would lose his seat of Uxbridge, and the Tories would end up 100 seats behind Labour. And massive swing for support as well for some of the smaller parties, 9% for some of those smaller parties too. I mean, Lettice, is the party over for Boris Johnson?
I mean, there is no denying they've had a bit of a shocking year.
Not the Christmas party, by the way. The Christmas party obviously isn't over, but just the party in general.
No, exactly. They've had a shocking year of scandals and sleaze. Obviously, everything with COVID. And I'm definitely quite shook that they continuously believe that they will not get caught. You know, at a time when we're going through such tough times, we need a government that's going to lead by example. And there is no doubt that the public feels very let down at the moment. But Boris himself has also managed to alienate his own MPs, such as, you know, forcing through the vaccine passports, the huge failure that was North Shropshire election, where there was an overturn of 23,000 vote majority, and now some backbenchers calling for a vote of no confidence. The future is definitely looking very bleak if something isn't done within Boris's government.
I mean, Atul, you should be thrilled as the editor of Labour Uncut. You should be thrilled with the direction of Boris Johnson. Authoritarian, big government, stepping in, having their fingers in every pie of people's lives. Higher taxes as well, biggest tax burden since the Second World War, an obsession with the green agenda. I mean, you whoever voted blue, they certainly got, well, we worked out earlier that it was probably a pooey colour, because it was green and a mixture of green and red. What do you say to that, Atul?
I think what the public are seeing is what, and certainly back in May, early this year, I wrote a piece on Labour Uncut saying that even though Boris Johnson was, I think at that point, like sort of 20 points ahead in preference Prime Minister, and the Conservatives were like sort of 10 points ahead, the actual, if you let the vaccine bounce unwind, the parties were near a level pegging. I think what everyone is seeing now the vaccine bounce is unwound, is Boris Johnson for all his flaws. He's a person who, he's a great front man in many respects. And, I say this as an opponent, he's part of the reason the Conservatives won that election, because in his personality, for all its flaws, he held together that coalition. But that man is not a decision maker. He's not a leader. And when you are the Prime Minister, you can't busk it. You have to attend meetings, read papers, make choices. And I don't think it's actually specifically a policy choice. I certainly don't think it's things such as COVID passports, which are leading to his fall in popularity. It's every now and then you get these events which are like asteroids hitting the political landscape, and the Christmas party affairs, because there was a seam of worry in the public from the point where Dominic Cummings took his trip to Durham, through Wallpaper Gate, and who financed the refurb of the Downing Street.
The list is endless. Listen, we've got to leave it there because we're running out of time. We've been speaking about the restrictions and COVID so much, we barely had time for anything else. But good to talk to you both. Atul Hatwell, Labour Uncut editor, Lettice Bromovsky as well, political commentator. Coming up, we'll have